you so much, and thank you for this opportunity to be with you today. Um, I I agree with Jose Ignacio's assessment regarding the Constitution. I think it's very important that as we look at different leaders around the world, each one is using their Constitution and sort of rewriting the rules of the game in a manner in which to consolidate more power. But I'm just going to take a step back. I many years ago was the staff director of the Middle East subcommittee over in the House of Representatives, and back in 2015 we held a hearing regarding Tunisia's democratic transition, and in that time, both sides of the aisle, members of Congress, praised Tunisia for adopting a new constitution, electing a parliament, holding election, transferring power, even recognized the National Dialogue Quartet and the fact that they won the Nobel Peace Prize. So for many of us back then, we saw Tunisia as a success story that many of us hoped could be emulated in other countries or other countries within the Middle East. But I think it's important to recognize that democracy is more than just elections. Democracies also need to embrace citizen responsive governance, respect for human rights, ensuring strong institutions, protecting the rule of law, upholding a checks and balance system, obviously respecting constitutional order, and hoping to achieve some economic prosperity. So as we look at what has occurred in Tunisia, not only do we have this constitutional problem, but we'd also need to recognize and be upfront and honest about the feelings and the sentiments regarding Tunisians, right? Many Tunisians feel let down by the democratic transition. They expected that these new freedoms were going to give them economic prosperity, and that did not happen to their satisfaction. They were frustrated, obviously, with the elected legislative body. And that frustration was due to inflation, unemployment, corruption, COVID. But that was the sentiment that Zaid was able to tap into, which is why for many months, at least at that time, over 80% of Tunisians approved Zaid's actions. So when the international community comes out and condemns, Zaid says, wait a minute, I'm doing what the people want me to do. So I'm okay. But as we have learned from history and from different countries around the world, just because actions may be popular with the masses does not mean they're legal or democratic. I give the example of the United States. In the United States, the US Congress approval ratings are extremely low. That does not mean that the president of the United States can, on a whim, just dissolve the United States Congress. It's not possible. So, these are some of the things that we got to take a look at. Obviously, from a DC perspective, we have to see Tunisia in a greater context. I personally have a lot of concerns regarding authoritarians from outside the region who are having influence, specifically Russia and China. We've seen that Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov has visited Tunisia before in the past, pushed for many agreements between both countries. And one of the biggest fears that I have is that Russia already has a port in Syria. And if they can set up shop in Tunisia, in my opinion, that undermines the free flow of goods and commerce through the Mediterranean. So that's something to be looking out for. And obviously, on the China front, we have seen that Tunis is seeking more investments from China, which could be problematic from a U.S. national interest perspective. On the economic side, this is also something that I think everybody needs to be looking at, regardless of who's in power and regardless of what the current government is doing or what the opposition wants to do. There needs to be a consensus on what is the plan to deal with the Tunisian economy. Unemployment is on the rise. I think it's close to 18%. Youth unemployment is even worse, around 36%. Back in 2004, there was the famous Tunisia youth bulge, which back then existed, which means now, folks are in their 30s and 40s, which is at the critical stage, obviously, when folks are trying to find a job. And, obviously we cannot forget that at one point, Tunisia had per capita the highest number of ISIS fighters. So from a security standpoint, it's something that we need to pay attention to. On the European Union side, obviously the EU is the largest economic partner to Tunisia, which is why I think there has to be a lot of collaboration between the US and the EU to make sure that we're working together to tackle this problem. From the US perspective, one of the things that we have in our tool belt is something that doesn't get much attention, which is a Tunisian American Enterprise Fund, which is an entity that is supported by the US government to support small and medium-sized companies, and has demonstrated some limited success in Tunisia, even during these difficult times. After I left Congress, I went to go work for USAID. And while at USAID, we elevated the presence of our operations in Tunisia. We had a very small office, and we upgraded that into a full USAID mission, which is something that I'm very much proud of. And this agreement gives the US just another leverage point that we can use when we're talking about Tunisia. Now, as Juan Ignacio pointed to the Venezuela example, I'm going to take that a little bit further. From a Tunisia standpoint, we saw President Zayed start ruling by decree. Well, we have seen in Haiti that ruling by decree is not a good way of doing business. We have seen Zayed reinterpret the rules in terms of the Tunisian constitution. We have seen that play out by dictators in Venezuela and Nicaragua, who have achieved and acquired more power through fraudulent elections, corruption, controlling the judiciary, ignoring the constitution, and disregarding the rule of law. So even though right now, one can make the argument that Zayed may not have gone as far as Ortega or Maduro, but these are some of the concerns that we are heading in that direction. Even in Chile, for example, Chile spent many years conducting a very inclusive process that heard a lot of input from its citizens regarding their constitution, something that did not happen in Tunisia. And even today, just a few hours ago in Peru, you see the example of President Castillo dissolving, even though he claims it's going to be temporary, dissolving his parliament and using it as an excuse to prevent a vote in accordance with the Peruvian constitution. And so far we'll see what happens, but many believe that this move by President Castillo is illegal. So these are something that we need to be looking into, not only from a Tunisia perspective, but how Tunisia fits globally. Now, in terms of recommendations from a US standpoint, so back in the day when Tunisia, as I said, first started to transition to a democracy, the US stepped in and granted Tunisia a major non-NATO ally designation. This is a very important designation that not many countries in the world have. And that is something that could be rescinded if things do not improve. At the same time, the US can provide incentives to try to change the behavior of the current government. We all know about the Millennium Challenge Corporation. They have been holding on a $500 million economic assistance package. And if we see some progress, that is something that we can use to improve the economic situation in the country. Obviously, we've discussed the IMF and the 1.9. I think it's very telling that the government asked for $4 billion and the IMF was only willing to give 1.9. But as this vote comes up this month, It'll be very telling to see if they condition any of this support and use sort of democratic levers to condition the support. So in conclusion, I just want to say that, you know, the Tunisian people have really proven to be resourceful. And history has shown us that Tunisians are equipped to find a political solution. In many countries around the world, people believe that the opposition cannot get together for a common cause. And Tunisia has proven that it did so once. And all of us are hoping that we can do that again, because we want Tunisia to succeed. And we need it to succeed. We've been very clear-eyed on trying to, in my opinion, do a bit of a carrot and stick approach to be able to incentivize good behavior. But ultimately, the US and the international community, they need to apply pressure now. I am one who believes that if we would have applied pressure after July 25th, maybe we wouldn't be in the position we are today. So time is definitely not on our side. We should coalesce around supporting democratic institutions and upholding free and fair elections under a legitimate, respectful, and inclusive process before the situation gets worse. The example that I give on some of the countries in Latin America, it tells us that we in the United States and the international community either acted late or did not act at all to prevent some of these catastrophes in Latin America. And we must not make that same mistake in Tunisia. Thank you.